Your furnace runs all winter, and you still feel cold drafts coming through the walls. A medieval peasant family heated one room with a single open fire in a house made of mud and sticks through winters that were colder than anything most of us have ever lived through. And they survived. Not because they were tougher than us, although they were, but because they knew things about staying warm that we have completely forgotten. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how they did it, and I promise you, at least one of these methods is going to surprise you. I am Arthur Finch, and this is Forgotten Centuries, where we dig up the knowledge the modern world threw away. And before we begin, I have gathered everything from this series into one illustrated book, the Forgotten Household Almanac. You will find the link in the pinned comment. Now let me set the stage. Because the winters we are talking about were not ordinary winters. Starting around the 14th century, Europe entered a period that historians call the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped across the continent. Rivers that never froze began freezing solid. Growing seasons shortened. Harvests failed. In northern Europe, a bad winter could bring weeks of hard frost, with temperatures falling well below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And the people facing those winters had no furnace, no insulation as we know it, no glass in their windows, and in most cases, no chimney. So how did they not freeze to death in their beds? The answer starts with the house itself, and this is where the forgotten genius begins. A typical peasant house was built from something called wattle and daub. Wattle was a woven lattice of thin wooden branches, a bit like a basket stretched between the timber frame of the house. Daub was the mixture they smeared over it, and here is the part that sounds disgusting but worked brilliantly. Daub was made of wet clay, straw, and animal dung, all mixed together and pressed into the wattle by hand. When it dried, it formed a thick, solid wall. The straw trapped thousands of tiny air pockets inside the material, and trapped air is the basis of almost all insulation, including the insulation in your walls right now. The dung acted as a binder that kept the wall from cracking as it dried. So that humble wall of mud and manure was doing the same job as modern fiberglass insulation, 600 years early. Then there was the roof. Peasant roofs were thatched, meaning they were covered in bundles of dried straw or reeds, packed tight and layered up to a foot thick. Thatch is a remarkable insulator. All those hollow stems full of trapped air formed a thermal blanket over the entire house. Heat rises, and in a thatched house, that rising heat hit a foot of packed straw and stayed inside. A well-thatched roof also shed rain and snow itself would settle on top and add yet another layer of insulation. The house was essentially wearing a winter coat. The windows, where they existed at all, were small, and that was deliberate. No peasant could afford glass. Windows were just openings, covered with wooden shutters, or with oiled cloth or scraped animal hide that let in a dull glow of light while blocking the wind. Small openings, thick walls, low ceilings, and a small floor plan. Every design choice pointed the same direction. Keep the heated air in, and keep the moving cold air out. Modern builders call this managing air infiltration. Medieval peasants just called it building a house. Now let us talk about the heart of the whole system, the fire. Most peasant houses had no fireplace and no chimney. Instead, there was an open hearth, right in the middle of the main room, usually just a ring of stones on the packed earth floor. The smoke rose up and found its way out through the thatch or through a small vent hole in the roof. Yes, the house was smoky, chronically smoky. But the central position of that hearth was not laziness. A fireplace against an outside wall sends a huge share of its heat straight out of the building. A fire in the center of the room radiates heat in every direction, into the room, into the people, and into the packed earth floor and hearthstones around it, which soaked up warmth during the day and released it slowly through the night like a storage heater. And that brings me to one of my favorite pieces of forgotten knowledge in this entire story, and it is hiding inside a word you already know. At night, you could not leave an open fire blazing in a house made of straw and timber while everyone slept. House fires were one of the great killers of the age. But you also could not let the fire die, because starting a new fire with flint and steel on a freezing morning was slow, miserable work. So every night, peasants performed a ritual called banking the fire. They raked the embers into a pile and buried them under a thick layer of ash, or covered them with a dome-shaped ceramic lid. Starved of air, the embers could not flame up, but they stayed alive, glowing quietly under the ash all night long, still radiating gentle heat into the room. In the morning, you swept the ash aside, dropped dry tinder onto the embers, blew gently, and the fire came back to life in seconds. That ceramic cover had a name in medieval French. It was called a couvre-feu, which literally means cover the fire. In many towns, a bell rang in the evening to tell everyone it was time to cover their fires for the night. The English heard couvre-feu and turned it into a word we still use today, curfew. Every time you hear about a curfew on the news, you are hearing the echo of a medieval fire safety ritual. The bell that told you to be home at night was originally the bell that told you to bank your hearth. If you enjoy finding out that this kind of knowledge is hiding all around us, this is exactly what Forgotten Centuries is about. So consider subscribing, because there are a lot more centuries where this one came from. Now, a banked fire and thick walls will keep a house above freezing, but the peasants had another source of heat, and this one had 4 legs. Across medieval Europe, especially in the north, many peasant families lived in what historians call a longhouse, or a byre house. It was one long building under one roof, divided into 2 ends. The family lived at one end, the livestock lived at the other. Cows, oxen, sometimes sheep and goats, all stabled inside the same building, often separated from the living space by nothing more than a low partition or a cross passage. To modern ears, that sounds miserable, the smell alone. But consider what a cow actually is, from a heating point of view. A single cow gives off roughly as much heat as a small space heater, constantly, all night long, fueled by hay. Put 3 or 4 cattle at one end of a small, well-insulated building, and you have installed central heating that also gives you milk. The animals warmed the house protected the animals from the cold that could kill them, and the family slept in the warm end of the building. Nothing was wasted, and everyone, human and animal, got through the winter together. Farmers in cold countries went on using this arrangement into the 20th century because it simply worked. So the house is insulated, the fire is banked, the cattle are steaming gently at the far end of the building. Now let us talk about what people actually wore, because medieval winter clothing was a system, and it was smarter than it looks. The foundation of everything was wool. Sheep were everywhere in medieval Europe, and wool was the fabric of ordinary life. But wool has properties that made it almost perfect for this world. Wool fibers are crimped, which means they trap huge amounts of air, and again, trapped air means insulation. Raw wool also contains lanolin, the natural grease from the sheep's fleece, which makes the fabric shed water. And here is the property that mattered most. Wool keeps a large share of its insulating power even when it is damp. In a climate of freezing rain and wet snow, where getting soaked could genuinely kill you, a material that stays warm when wet was not a comfort. It was a survival technology. Underneath the wool, those who could afford it wore linen. A linen shirt or shift sat against the skin, soft where wool was itchy, and it pulled sweat away from the body. Damp skin loses heat fast, so keeping the skin dry mattered as much as blocking the wind. Linen against the skin, wool over the top, and then more wool over that. A tunic, then a heavier overtunic, then a cloak, then a hood that covered the head and shoulders together. Layer upon layer, each one trapping its own blanket of air. Notice what they were doing. A wicking base layer, an insulating mid-layer, a weather-resistant outer layer. That is precisely the layering system that modern outdoor clothing companies print on their labels today. Hikers pay hundreds of dollars for it. Medieval peasants wore it every day, in scratchier form, because centuries of cold winters had taught them what works. We did not invent layering. we rediscovered it. Feet and hands got the same treatment. Leather shoes were stuffed with straw or wrapped in wool cloth. People wound long strips of wool around their legs and feet, and on the worst days they simply added more straw, more cloth, more wool, until the cold was held at bay. Which brings us to the night, because the night was the real test. The fire is banked to embers. The temperature outside is dropping toward its lowest point. How do you sleep through that and wake up alive? The first answer is that almost nobody slept alone. The whole family typically shared one bed or one sleeping space, parents, children, sometimes grandparents, all together under the same covers. Body heat was a resource, and sleeping together pooled it. What looks like poverty to modern eyes was also strategy. A shared bed on a freezing night was the difference between shivering until dawn and sleeping warm. The bed itself was usually a thick mattress of straw or hay, sometimes stuffed into a cloth sack, laid on a low frame or on boards to keep it off the cold floor. A thick layer of dry straw is genuinely warm. It insulates you from below, which matters enormously, because the ground steals heat from a sleeping body faster than the air does. On top came wool blankets, woven coverlets, sheepskins, cloaks pressed into service as extra bedding, whatever the household owned, all piled on together. Then there were the accessories, and one of them will be familiar to your grandparents. Before bed, stones or bricks were set close to the hearth to soak up heat, then wrapped in cloth and tucked under the covers, down by the feet. A hot stone wrapped in wool stays warm for hours. In wealthier homes, this evolved into metal warming pans filled with embers, swept between the sheets before the family climbed in. The hot water bottle in your closet is the direct descendant of a medieval hearthstone. In parts of Europe, people went one step further and built the bed itself into a piece of furniture. The box bed was a wooden cabinet with a mattress inside and doors or curtains that closed. Climb in, shut the doors, and your own body heat warmed the small enclosed space within minutes, no fire required. It was a warm room inside a cold room, sized for exactly the people sleeping in it. Ruthlessly efficient, and honestly, it sounds rather cozy. And here is one last thing about medieval nights that most people have never heard, and it changes how you picture the whole world before electricity. Many historians now believe that people in this era did not sleep in one single block the way we try to. The historical record from these centuries is full of casual references to something called first sleep and second sleep. People went to bed not long after dark, slept for a few hours, and then woke naturally around the middle of the night. For an hour or so they lay quietly, talked, prayed, tended the fire, and then drifted into their second sleep until dawn. Writers of the time mentioned it in passing, without explanation, the way you might mention breakfast. It was simply how nights worked. On a winter night, that midnight waking had a practical use too. It was a chance to check the embers, add a layer, pull a child back under the blankets. The long dark of winter was not fought, it was inhabited. So let us step back and look at what these people actually built, with mud, straw, wool, and fire. Insulated walls and roofs. Central radiant heating with overnight heat storage. Animal-powered supplemental heat. A 3-layer clothing system that outdoor brands still copy. Insulated bedding, heat packs, shared warmth, and enclosed sleeping spaces. There is not a single piece of magic in that list. It is physics, learned the hard way, refined over centuries, and passed down parent to child. Because in that world, this knowledge was not trivia. It was the family's survival plan, tested every single winter. We look back at medieval peasants and see poverty, and yes, their lives were hard in ways we can barely imagine. But look closer and you see something else. A deep, practical intelligence about heat, materials, and the human body. An intelligence we let slip away the moment the furnace switched on. They did not have our technology, but they understood cold better than we ever will. And winter was only half the battle, because staying warm means nothing if you cannot eat. And these same households kept meat, milk, and vegetables from spoiling for months at a time, with no refrigerator, no icebox, and no electricity. The methods they used are just as clever as everything you heard today, and one of them is still hanging from the ceiling of farmhouse kitchens right now. That is what we are digging up in the next video. And if you want all of this knowledge in one place, every method, every lost skill, fully illustrated, my Forgotten Household Almanac is waiting for you in the pinned comment below. I am Arthur Finch, and this has been Forgotten Centuries.